Okay, good morning, everyone. As you know, we've switched to a new shorter format, so it's just the talk and some questions related to it. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Sarah, who's kindly agreed to speak this morning, straight back from a lecture. At least she hasn't had to rush across the campus to do that. So different times. So Sarah is from civil engineering, and she's going to give a really topical talk, particularly the way things are ramping up all over again now around COVID and the kind of experiences, perceptions and responses in the water sector. And it sounds like a really kind of interesting, responsive project, shall we say, that came out of a chance encounter, and sounds like it was something that was really worthwhile. So I really look forward to hearing about it. So over to you, Sarah. Thanks very much.
Thanks. So I'm just going to quickly turn my camera off because in my lecture it kept becoming a little bit unstable. So hopefully the internet connection will last through my talk, and I'll come back on later. So as Taz just suggested, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of a lockdown project that I carried out with some collaborators in the UK. It's really nice to be able to talk about a topic that everyone's familiar with instead of trying to explain what a microbial electrolysis cell is and how we can make power from poo, which is my Twitter handle for those of you that didn't come across this event on Twitter. So as everyone is aware, late last year, an acute respiratory disease caused by a novel coronavirus emerged in China, and by March, it had spread to more than 110 countries, and a lot of countries started to implement nationwide lockdowns. People were told not to leave their homes. This kind of led to a lot of panic buying, people starting to stock up on things that they deemed to be essential. And one of those things was toilet paper. So we very quickly started to run out of toilet paper and people had to buy alternatives. And for those of you that don't work in the water sector, a lot of these items are actually unflushable and can wreak havoc downstream on the wastewater infrastructure. At the same time, there was kind of the rapid closure of the hospitality industry, which led to the mass disposal of beverages. So beer and milk was literally poured down the drain. And this was a threat of an unknown scale. And so my colleagues and I in the UK wanted to find out how resilient the sector was to such a shock. So resilience is often looked at for things like climate change, but essentially it can be used to assess any system when that system is subject to any threat. And in this case, the threat was COVID-19, but later I'll talk about how there could have been, and in some cases were, multiple threats occurring simultaneously. So back in May, the research team and I co-designed a survey with the Chartered Institution for Water and Environmental Management, CIWEM, and we had a panel session with a number of different sector experts. So there were 7 different UK water companies and 3 consultancies, and the people that were involved with this were all involved at a strategic level with their company's COVID-19 response. So we got ethical approval and sent it out for about 2 weeks for the responses to come back in. And we got about 500 responses. So we designed the survey so that it would capture the challenges in a chronological manner. So we wanted to look at if there were any impacts and any consequences. So to do this, we used these kind of 4 pillars that come out of David Butler's resilience framework. And this basically looks at the mitigation measures that were in place and how prepared the sector had been, as well as things like the adaptation mechanisms that had been deployed in order to respond to the threat or the crisis, how individuals and organisations had coped, and finally, what lessons had been learned from that. So the questionnaire was kind of structured in 2 halves, and the first part sought to find out about employees' experiences, and the second part looked at those employees' perceptions of organisational response. So I haven't got time to go into either of these things in great detail, so I'll just try and provide a bit of a balanced snapshot. So ordinarily about 10% of the sector routinely worked from home, but overnight this changed to 84% of people. So it was a huge shift. But there was some evidence to suggest that different groups were coping in different ways. So fewer women reported an increase in productivity than men, but more women reported a decrease in well-being than men. It was really hard to kind of tease out the actual differences because individuals, regardless of their gender or their job type, were all coping with the pandemic in different ways and therefore adapting to the pandemic in different ways. So some had childcare responsibilities, whereas others would struggle with isolation. So similar trends were seen for essential workers. So essential workers were more likely to report an increase in productivity. And this, I guess, highlights the ability of workers to proceed with tasks when everyday obstacles, things like getting stuck in traffic, are lessened. Non-essential workers are, interestingly, those who didn't know whether they were an essential worker or not, so they didn't know what their status was. These people were more likely to report a decrease in well-being. And this probably highlights the fact of how important communication is and that uncertainty arising from poor communication can affect well-being. This, I know, is a very busy slide, but it gives an overview of the 8 most prevalent themes in the study. So obviously it was qualitative research and we used NVivo to kind of code the main themes that came out of that. But these were the kind of the 8 themes. So I'll just pick a few of them to discuss in a bit more detail. So working from home was the most frequently mentioned thing. It was the main form of adaptation, a large part of the new normal, but it was still seen as a significant challenge to overcome. Communication largely centered around the guidance that water companies sought from the regulators. So in the UK, this would be Ofwat, the economic regulator, and the Environment Agency. So they wanted more guidance on their compliance and understanding around regulation, penalties and rewards. So the outcome delivery incentives that are known as ODIs. Finance included the impact on individuals. So this was things like the job losses or the ability to pay their water bills, as well as the cost burden on water companies. And this was arising from the change in the wastewater load from the disposal of the milk and beer, which obviously meant that the companies had to buy in more energy to be able to treat the wastewater, as well as a decrease in revenue from the change in water use. So obviously with more people working from home, there was a shift from primarily metered commercial buildings to primarily unmetered domestic buildings. So where the water was getting used affected the amount of revenue that the companies were getting. IT issues was primarily a challenge that was at the beginning of the outbreak. So it was reported to have been resolved quite quickly. This was largely due to the huge capacity of people that were trying to work from home and the lack of infrastructure, but also the inability to be able to connect to corporate networks and software, and complaints about video call fatigue, which kind of had knock-on effects on well-being. Site work was something that had primarily a logistical focus. So it was concerns about how work could take place if individuals cannot travel outside of their region, if they can't stay overnight somewhere, how can they do the work? But also some of those elements of the change in potable water use and the use of non-flushables, which led to sewer blockages, they were all mentioned here as well. The last thing I want to mention on this slide was that there were quite a lot of participants that noted that a disruption of this scale really presented an opportunity to embrace the circular economy. A lot of people referred to the reduced emissions from not commuting and traveling to work, and wanted to see kind of a really stronger, more committed focus to a greener recovery on the outset from this. So this is my final slide, and it just kind of ties things back with that original framework that we had. So we analysed each of the findings in terms of mitigation, adaptation, coping and learning. And most participants thought that the crisis plans developed were adequate to cope with a single threat, and that this was largely in part due to the Brexit preparations that had contributed to this. But what's kind of come out of this, and a follow-on study that I'm doing as well, suggests that the companies were essentially operating in risk mode rather than resilience mode. And this means that the system can probably cope with one crisis or one threat, but if we start to see multiple threats, like we saw in Ireland, in Dublin, where there was a hosepipe ban, there was a drought at the same time as the pandemic, this then becomes a lot more challenging for a system that's operating in risk mode rather than resilience mode. The key learnings from this highlight the importance of robust IT systems and good communication. But one of the things that kind of really came through as a central theme was about collaboration, and collaboration not only in kind of the fun kind of innovation R&D side of things, but also in that crisis planning side. So people were suggesting that future crisis plans should transcend organisational boundaries and prepare for prolonged crises of international magnitude in the future, and that these should be developed kind of multi-organisationally, and think about different threats occurring at the same time. So in that vein, I'm currently working on a follow-up paper with the same collaborators, and this is on the basis of some semi-structured interviews with strategic level employees at the different water companies to find out what planning was carried out to assess the vulnerability of these water systems, and to find out how the individual water companies actually responded operationally. So what measures they actually put in terms of how they operated their water assets to cope with these shock changes. And then in Ireland, I'm looking to apply this learning to evaluate the resilience of water infrastructure to multiple threats. And hopefully this will align with the National Water Resources Plan that Irish Water is currently about to release. So that's everything that I've got from there. So I'll just stop sharing.